Hi everyone. This week I want to talk about two aspects of creative nonfiction that you'll pay attention to when you write, and those are voice and persona. Last week we talked about structure, about that aspect of macro structure especially, and how macro structure is really what it looks like on the page, how you organize space and time, in other words. Voice and persona fall under those things that I called microstructure, how you choose language, how you choose the words you use, and the impact they have. They work together, but we'll talk about them separately and then we'll talk about them together. Okay, so persona is who you are on the page, the aspects of yourself that you reveal to your readers. You might want to think about this like you're a character. Who am I? And what parts of me are most important for my readers to know? And then voice is how do you tell it? And that falls into word choice, the words you use, how you structure your sentences, and what kind of meaning you can get across to your readers because of those sentences. And we'll get into both of those in a little bit more detail. First thing I want to talk about is persona. And persona really boils down to identity, the parts of you. One way I look at identity is the whole concept of hats. What hats are you wearing? So if I was to describe myself to someone, I would say that I identify as a woman. I am queer. I'm an instructor. I'm a spouse. I'm an aunt. Sometimes I talk about family roles as far as being a daughter. Even though when I get into that, I have to get into the idea of chosen family too, because my birth parents and I aren't in contact. So then sometimes I have to get into like I'm an estranged daughter. I talk about how I grew up in Kentucky. I grew up lower class, and I'm a first generation college student. All of those things. Sometimes I'll talk about faith, sometimes not. It just depends. But not all of those aspects experience the world the same way, or at least the same events the same way. And that's what you want to think about when writing. What parts of me does the reader need to know to understand my story that I'm telling them? If I want to write about growing up queer in a very religious household that was also very anti-LGBTQ plus, in a nutshell, then in that aspect, then the part of my identity that's the most important is the part of me that identifies as queer. But if I want to talk about being a domestic abuse survivor, that aspect of me that was my queerness may not have been as important. In that aspect, it's more about me as a survivor. And you can write about the same topic or sort of topic in different ways depending on how things impact you in that moment. So I've published 2 essays about Supernatural because that's my favorite TV show and I've written about it a lot. One of them was about a storyline in season 13 in which the Archangel Gabriel is captured by the Prince of Hell, Asmodeus, and is kind of tortured. Up until this moment, we had thought Gabriel was dead, and then we found out he's not. And when I'm watching that season 13, the first thing that comes to mind isn't that I'm seeing this character get tortured. This is how I felt as I was being abused and how I felt as I was recovering from that abuse. So when I wrote about that, I had to think about myself that I was a woman. I was a domestic abuse survivor. I was someone who grew up being told that basically the first time you sleep with someone, you had to marry them or stay with them, and all of those things came into play. So when I was trying to leave him, I had all of these feelings. So those were the parts of me that interacted with that episode. Another essay I published, what comes from season 11, which is my favorite season in the entire series, where we find out, I think it's episode 20 or 21, it's called Don't Call Me Shirley, where we find out that this character, Chuck, isn't a prophet. He's actually the representation of God on the show. And he's a writer. And not only is he God, but he mentions that he'd had boyfriends and girlfriends as he had been masquerading as Chuck the prophet on the planet, on Earth. And so in that aspect, when I wrote that essay, it wasn't important that I was a domestic abuse survivor. So that kind of like that part of my identity got pushed to the side. What I did talk about was growing up queer in a religious household, being told that everything that I was kind of wrong, all of those things. And seeing that on the moment on the screen showed me how much I was still carrying that burden. So when I wrote that essay, that's what I focused on. And then I was able to meet the actor who plays Chuck. And so then there's an aspect of like fangirlness that went out to the essay, because I talked about how I meant to talk to him about that episode. Other essays I've written about being an aunt and how it feels to connect, especially with one of my nieces who may be moving in with us. So in that aspect, I'm focused more on those parts of my identity that connect with her. All that to say is that, and I'm just using myself as an example here, just to say that when I'm writing, I have to think, who am I, and how did it impact? What parts of me experience this? And what parts of me does my reader need to know when I'm writing this essay in order for them to understand it? Remember, your readers don't know anything about you. And it's impossible to say everything there is to know about you in one essay. First of all, if you did that, then you never need to write anything else because you've written everything about you. The other part is that we're just really complicated, complex beings. And you have to think, I need my reader to know me enough to understand these events, but I don't need them to know everything because that's just too much information and it doesn't seem to interact or work with the essay. So what you want to do is think, what facets of my identity are important? How do they pertain to my story? And how does my reader, and why does my reader need to know them? If they don't fit, then maybe that's another essay. This also helps me organize my thoughts. I'm a very scattered person when it comes to writing or thinking. And sometimes it just helps me to sit down and say, okay, this is what I want to write about. What parts of me are important and how do I explain them to my reader? Do I want to explicitly mention them, or do I want the reader to kind of interpret the essay and assume by reading? And both of those are valid. It just depends on how you want it to come about. You just want it to be organically in the essay. You don't want to start an essay with, my name is this and I've done this. Sometimes they come about later on. Sometimes you can do a sentence that reveals it. But overall, you just want to think, how does it fit into the essay? And if it doesn't fit, then maybe it doesn't belong in this piece. And maybe it's a second essay you can write that's related. Or memoir, or whatever you're looking at. I know some of you may be working on parts of a larger book. Okay, the second thing I want to talk about is voice. Voice also helps develop persona. And voice are the words you choose to tell your story. How you write it, the words you choose, the ways you organize sentences, things like that. This week, you're probably also getting feedback from your story draft from me or your fiction draft from me. And a lot of the comments I'm leaving are dealing with word choice. So something you want to think about when you go to revise this, when you do your revised portfolio at the end of the semester, is that maybe you want to think about voice from the CNF lecture to apply to your fiction or your poetry. So all of these can kind of work together in different types of writing. So regardless of what type of piece you're writing, you want to think about voice. But as CNF, it's another way to develop persona. My reader will know a little bit of who I am by the words I choose. These are things like tone and emotion. What kind of feeling do I want to get across to my reader? How do I feel about the experiences that I'm talking about? Am I angry? Am I mad? Am I sad? Am I excited? Am I happy? Am I reflective? Do you use slang or dialect? Do you speak primarily in Ave, which is African American Vernacular English? Do you speak using words like ain't and y'all, which I do all the time? Um, Things like that will impact how you write it. If it's how you speak outside of the classroom, then that may be how you want to write your piece. What level of emotion do you want to choose, from hyperbole, which is absolutely big emotion and excited and exaggerating, to reserved? Maybe you're a more reserved, quieter person. And either way you tell it, that's absolutely fine. You just want to make sure that you're kind of giving your reader an idea of who you are. Some tips I have: if I start by writing on the page, I'll read it out loud and say, does this sound natural? Does this sound like something I would say? Or does it not? Sometimes we think, well, an instructor is going to read this, so I want to make sure that it sounds academic. But with creative nonfiction, this isn't like, you don't want to sound too academic unless that's the type of persona you're taking. You want to focus more on how would you naturally say it. If I was going to tell the story to someone I trust, what words would I use? What words do you choose and use typically when you're speaking? And how do you feel, and what emotions do you experience when reflecting on the events you're writing about? If you have dark humor, if you are someone who uses dark humor, or you're kind of sarcastic, then that'll probably find its way into your writing. If you use profanity, that's okay too. You want to use it so that it fits with the piece, and not, and you don't, or you want to try to avoid using it in such a way that it shocks your reader. But if that's how you speak, that's how you speak. That's who you are. A lot of times, what impacts voice negatively is editing. Sometimes when we revise, we will edit our voice out because we're so worried about how we sound to a reader. And which is, the ironic thing with that is that honestly, using a natural voice makes you more appealing to a reader. So with me, when I'm first writing, I write without thinking and just get it on the page. Or I will sometimes use speech to text software, so that I can think, how would I tell the story if I spoke it out loud? And then you'll revise to make sure it can be understood, and to get out things like and ahs and things like that. But still, you want to try to at least make it sound natural. Voice and persona together should reveal you to the reader. They should reveal where you're from, your background, how you feel about your experiences, and reveal how you experience the world around you, which is key for solid creative nonfiction writing, and honestly any type of writing, except if this is fiction, you would think the same questions, but with your character. When I'm writing creative nonfiction, one thing I think of is, how do I make sure this is natural, and how do I explain myself? And that's where voice and persona come from. We've all heard the phrase show, not tell, although honestly, they work together. Showing and telling, they work together a little bit better than that. But the way you use tone and persona, that's a way of showing instead of telling, because you're showing who you are without saying who you are in a lot of ways. So let's look at some examples of essays we've read, and we'll break down and look at some aspects of voice and persona in each. First one I want to use is from The Clan of One-Breasted Women by Terry Tempest Williams. This is one of my favorite essays. If you took me for 102, you've already read this. If you're planning on taking me for 102, you'll read this again. But it's just a brilliant piece to me. And the way that Terry Tempest Williams unfolds persona in this essay is brilliant. In Mormon culture, authority is respected, obedience is revered, and independent thinking is not. I was taught as a young girl to not make waves or rock the boat. Just let it go, mother would say. You know how you feel, that's what counts. So right there, we know that's her persona. We know she's someone who was born and raised in a religious background where she was told not to make waves, where she was told that you should always be obedient. But we also get an idea that she's probably not that person, that she's rebelling against that. And that's what happens here. For many years, I have done just that, listened, observed, and quietly formed my own opinions in a culture that rarely asks questions because it has all the answers. So here she also has a little bit of irony, where she's showing some contrast here. But one by one, I have watched the women in my family die common, heroic deaths. And that line there says so much about Voice and who she is, the common heroic that Voice changed. We sat in waiting rooms hoping for good news, but always receiving the bad. I cared for them, bathed their scarred bodies, and kept their secrets. I watched beautiful women become bald as cytoxins, cisplatin, and adriamycin were injected into their veins. I held their foreheads as they vomited green-black bile, and I shot them with morphine when the pain became inhuman. In the end, I witnessed their last peaceful breaths, becoming a midwife to the rebirth of their souls. So how do you feel? How do you think she feels? So she's kind of rebelling against this idea of being quiet. But when she reflects on these quiet moments with these women, she's also very somber. So I get a feeling that she's probably mad in this rebellion, but her anger isn't directed at this moment, it's directed at the situation. So that anger kind of comes and goes. And you may pick up on different things, and that's okay too. But here, she brings out all of those aspects kind of organically. She doesn't say a lot of women died from cancer. She explains how they died from cancer and brings in those more specific images that she saw. Elizabeth Felicetti, lifeless. Here in this quote, it's important that she's a bird watcher, clergy, a daughter who's losing her father or has lost him at this point by now. And she talks about him. She talks about being clergy is a demanding vocation, even more so when struggling with my own pain. So she's talking about trying to be a clergy member while also dealing with losing her father. And then she has a list of all of the things he did to try to fight prostate cancer. In 2014, a year before my father died, I visited my parents. Dad wanted to take me to the Hasayampa River Preserve, an hour outside of Phoenix. Hasayampa is a Yavapai word meaning upside down. Dad had been talking about this idea for years, having read about the preserve in the newspaper. The rest of my family worried about our trip. Dad drove poorly, walked very slowly, and sitting was painful. He carried a cushion everywhere. We drove to the preserve despite everyone's warnings. On our way there, as usual, he said, I hope you see something new. To change the subject, I asked, what is your favorite bird? Cardinal, he replied without hesitation. So here she's not only showing her voice, but she's showing her father's voice and this moment they had together. She's reflecting on this moment. She's organizing it as lists to try to talk about this really complex subject, which goes back to what we talked about structure last week. But she's also talking about and reflecting on how this experience felt to her. And it's more like a reflective thing. I could tell she was clergy without they're telling me that, just because it almost feels like a meditative sermon. Didn't She Almost Have It All by Claudia Lovemeyer. Claudia is someone who will be visiting us as well as Elizabeth when we have our writer roundtable for creative nonfiction. So here we have Claudia reflecting on meeting Whitney Houston. I didn't recognize her because she didn't look like Whitney Houston, but the girl was certainly Bobby Christina, and now Cece was greeting her friend from up on the stage, and the audience was clapping for the superstar. I was stunned. I'd seen addicts who'd hit rock bottom looking just like her, and yet I didn't expect to see Whitney appear so ravaged. So here we get an idea that Claudia is probably a really big fan of Whitney Houston. Now Cece was singing another song, and Whitney settled into her seat. She leaned over to the woman next to her and said she'd just gotten off a plane and was starved. I'm fat. I always have food in my purse. I happened to have a candy bar, and as God is my witness, I was not going to let Whitney go hungry. I leaned in and stage whispered to the superstar, Whitney? Her head whipped around as if she wanted to say, how dare you speak to me, you ordinary human being? I held out my offering. You want a candy bar? So here, We get an idea of persona. This is at a Christian conference, so we know that faith is important to Claudia. We know she's a fan of Whitney Houston. We also know she's someone who just has to take care of people, that she's not letting her fandom or fangirlness keep her from being this caregiving person. She mentions her weight, which is part of her identity, and she identifies as fat. So we know that's who she is. So through this, we get an idea of who she is in these quiet moments. And she also gives us a hint at maybe who Whitney Houston was. She uses something called conjecture when she says, as if she wanted to say. So that's her indication of saying, I don't know, this is what Whitney Houston was thinking, but in my memory, that's probably what she was thinking. Which is a way that you can get across other characters or other people in your essay who you may not have the luxury of being able to ask how they feel. Let's talk about Drug Facts by Lauren Turnbeth Newberger. We know in this essay that she's a sex worker. She is a survivor of abuse. She's rebelling against family. She doesn't write about the fact that she's okay now, that she's no longer a sex worker, that she's no longer battling these things. Not that being a sex worker is not okay. It's definitely a valid profession. She doesn't talk about how the fact who she is now. She was reflecting on who she was then. So this is a very narrow aspect of persona and a really good way of looking at persona. And also voice is just, the way she chooses language is one of the things that draws me to this essay over and over again, because it's a master class in phrasing and voice. She uses a almost like an epistolary structure as well, where she's talking to someone, or she's addressing it to you, who's the reader. And especially in inactive ingredients, this is a section I want to talk about when it comes to voice here. Nothing here is inactive, darling. Your body will tremble for the next 2 months like cicadas are trapped in your chest. Your heart, that meaty mass buried deep beneath your skin, it will beat so hard. It won't stop. Electricity will rush through you, and every inch of your skin will buzz so loudly you will think you can call those cicadas by name. You are flesh and burning, and you are so damn alive. Child, this I promise. Oh, at least you are alive. So here she's unapologetic. She has this voice and this way of describing that is very clear and specific, and we know that she is someone who sees the world in how she experiences it. She probably has a very physical way of experiencing the world. And that's the voice and the tone she uses. This unapologetic, this is what happened, so what, now I'm gonna write about it. Which is one way to talk about something controversial. Your readers, some of them may have a problem with what you're writing about. That's fine. That's their problem. One of my favorite quotes is from Anne Lamott. It's basically, you own everything that happened to you. If others wanted you to write nicely about them, then they should have behaved better. I didn't quote that exactly, but it's this idea, this unapologetic, this is what happened, here you go. But I'm going to write about it in a way that says that I'm not ashamed of those experiences, and I'm going to talk about this visceral beauty of it. And the last one I want to talk about is Can This Troubled Marriage Be Saved? Quiz by Nancy McCabe. Question 8 was, why have you stayed married all these years? And answer A was the one where I was really drawn to the voice in this essay. When you walked down the aisle on your father's arm, all the guests were tittering. Your husband-to-be stood before them in a tuxedo and high-top sneakers dyed black. You told yourself that you loved his humor, even if at that moment he was too busy scanning the audience, enjoying his joke, to watch you. You felt unreal anyway, as if you were only masquerading as a bride. Later, you and your husband cut the cake and you threw the bouquet, which bounced off the low ceiling uncaught. And then the skies opened and everyone clapped and cheered, because rain on the day of a wedding was good luck. Secretly, you felt beyond the influence of luck, unreal, like the character in someone else's story, speeding into an unknown dark future. You stared at your bright little star of the diamond and remembered from astronomy class why it was impossible to travel faster than the speed of light. Something about gaining mass before the faster you went, slowing yourself down. But if you didn't rush ahead, accumulating the weight of all of your regrets, who knew where you would find yourself? So here she's still someone who's very conflicted. And she's choosing the words and the language she uses to explain that conflict. Well, this is why I stayed married, because what would I be without it? And I think that tells more than if she had just said, we're not compatible. Or, I don't know, because I'm supposed to. So she's explaining that conflict, and that feeling of what else would I be is at the heart of this essay. So that's the aspect of her persona that she's going to have. Someone who is kind of going along with what she feels like she has to do. Someone who is unsure of her choices. But it's like, well, I guess I have to live with my choices and my decisions now. And through her voice, she explains that feeling and those aspects of herself. So that's basically voice and persona in a nutshell. One of the things I would say is that voice is something you don't think about when you write, especially when you're writing your draft. You just start writing, and then you see how the words come out of you, and that's your voice. It's often very intuitive. I don't always sit down and say, I'm going to write this piece, and I'm going to use y'all and ain't because that's why. I say, I'm going to write this piece like I would tell it to someone, and then I'm going to revise it to make sure it's clear, and the words that come out are the words that come out. So voice doesn't have to be something that you think about. It's something you want to think about as far as I don't want to get rid of it. I want to make sure my voice stays in this essay. And I hope that clarifies that a little bit. With persona, it's just how do I feel about it and what parts of me are important in a nutshell. I hope the examples helped. If you have any questions, I would love to talk to you about it. Creative Nonfiction is my baby, so I'm very excited and looking forward to reading more of it. Have a wonderful week, and I will see you all soon.